Hello again, 122. In this video we will conclude question 2 on the collapse and finally the revolution of 1911 in the end of the Qing Dynasty in China. There's more efforts at reform. By the late 1870s, it is obvious that the old dynasty was well on the road to internal disintegration, and to fend off the Taiping Rebellion, as we were talking about, they had to rely on armed forces under regional command. But unfortunately now, many of these regional commanders never disbanded, and they began to take over all these different little regions and collect taxes for their own use. These warlords then have established the dreaded pattern of imperial breakdown, and now you've got bands of semi-private armies roaming around the Chinese countryside. And this is a familiar pattern in Chinese history. Now the court began to listen to reform-minded officials who advocated a policy called self-strengthening, in which Western technology would be adapted while Confucian principles and institutions were maintained intact. This policy, popularly known by its slogan, East for Essence, West for Practical Use, remained China's guiding standard for a quarter of a century. Some even called for reforms in education, and the Manchus attempted to modernize the military and build an industrial base without disturbing the essential elements of traditional Chinese civilization. Railroads, weapons arsenals, and shipyards were built, but the value system has not changed, which means that you have the same type of political officials controlling affairs. During the last decades of the century, European penetration of China intensified. Rapacious imperialists began to bite off the outer edges of the empire, and we saw that map in the previous video of how their influence is now shrinking. All these areas in the north and Tibet, which all these people were non-Chinese and they were never fully assimilated, and they're lost. And China today and Tibet are arguing about who is in control of the affairs of that region. In the north and northwest, the main beneficiary was Russia, which forced the court to cede territories north of the Amur River in Siberia. Competition between Russia and Great Britain prevented either power from seizing Tibet outright, but it enabled the Tibetan authorities to revive their local autonomy. And again, this is why they argue about that today. The Lamaists under the Dalai Lama were able to, not the Dalai Lama at the time, but the previous one had reasserted their authority, and they don't want to see Han Chinese ruling their region, which is in the Himalayas and the far west of Asia. We've already talked about the British in Burma and the French in what will become Indochina. They're no longer vassals to the Manchu court. Even more ominous were the foreign spheres of influence which are being carved in the Chinese heartland, because the local commanders are willing to sell exclusive commercial and railroad building and mining privileges. And the future American president, Herbert Hoover, is going to make his fortune in the mines of mainland China. And the disintegration of the Manchu Dynasty really accelerated as the century came to an end. In 1894, the Qin, in the First Sino-Japanese War, they will fight over Japanese incursions into the Korean Peninsula, which threatened China's long-held suzerainty over the area, and there's more on that later in the chapter. The Chinese were roundly defeated, confirming to some critics that this policy of self-strengthening was not working its halfway. In 1897, Germany, a new entry in the race for spoils in East Asia, used the murder of 2 German missionaries by Chinese rioters as a pretext to demand territories in the Shandong Peninsula. The imperial court granted the demand, setting off a scramble for territories, and we'll see that map in a moment. Russia demanded the Landong Peninsula with its ice-free port at Port Arthur, and Great Britain now obtains its 100-year lease on the new territories adjacent to Hong Kong, as well as a coaling station in northern China. And the Brits will remain here, ladies and gentlemen, until 1999. Here's Port Arthur. And in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, Japan and Russia will fight, and Japan will gain control of this region. And now they have the stepping stone into colonizing Korea, which they will do in 1910. More on that coming up shortly in another chapter. And you see the different colors. This is British, blue is French, yellow is Japanese. They've already taken over the southern part of Korea. Purple is German. And the green, even the Italians have a small presence. Where are they at here? I can't even see it. It's very small. Can't find it. But it does not matter. You can see how the imperialists have carved up their spheres of influence in mainland China. The government responded with yet another effort at reform. In 1898, the progressive Confucian scholar Qing Manchu won support of the young Guangxu emperor for a comprehensive reform program patterned after recent measures in Japan. And during the next several weeks, the emperor will issue edicts calling for political, administrative, and educational reforms. Not surprisingly, Kang's proposals were opposed by the conservatives, who saw little advantage and much risk in copying the West. In other words, the status quo, those who are benefiting from this system, are now going to be in danger. More important, the new program was opposed by the emperor's aunt, the Empress Dowager Cixi, the real power at the court. She had begun her career as a concubine to an earlier emperor. After his death, she became the dominant force at court because Guangxu is a boy. And in 1878, he's placed on the throne, but she is really ruling in his name as regent. And with the aid of conservatives in the army, she arrested and executed several of the reformers and had the emperor incarcerated. So with Cixi's palace coup, the so-called 100 Days of Reform came to an end. And with encouragement from the British then, who hoped to avert total collapse of the Manchu Empire, in 1899, the U.S. Secretary of State John Hay proposed that the imperialist powers join together to ensure equal access to the China market for all states and to guarantee the territorial and administrative integrity of the Chinese Empire. Although it was probably motivated more for open markets for trade purposes than by some benevolent wish to protect China, the open door notes did have the practical effect of reducing the imperialist hysteria over access to China, and it prevented Russia, France, British interests, and the Germans from going to war sooner rather than later, as they're going to do in World War I. And this is the route that the International Expeditionary Force is going to take to suppress the Boxer Rebellion, which was provoked by a damaging drought and high unemployment caused in part by foreign activity. The construction of that railroad and steamships, for example, undercut the livelihood of barge workers on rivers and canal. And, ladies and gentlemen, this is a common story. Technology sometimes benefits some, but not everybody. There are people damaged by technological advancements. And the Boxers attacked the foreign residents, and they besieged the foreign legation quarter in Beijing until the expeditionary force arrived in late summer of 1900. And again, they'll be able to get there by using rail fairly quickly. And this is a cartoon that appeared in Leslie's Illustrated in October of 1900. Does Uncle Sam decide the fate of those rebels? Many Americans fought to suppress the Boxer Rebellion. Is China seeking a pardon from Uncle Sam? During the next few years, the old dynasty tried desperately to reform itself. Now the Empress is on board, and they finally trash the civil service examination. It's been around for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and a new educational system based on the Western model is introduced. And a commission is formed which will actually allow for some local autonomy, and there will be local legislative assemblies that will exist for a time, trying to issue some reforms. And it helps shore up the dynasty temporarily, but for our purposes, history shows that the most dangerous period for an authoritarian system is when it begins to reform itself, because change breeds instability, and performance rarely matches expectations. You raise people's hopes, ladies and gentlemen, and then their hopes are not reached. Revolutions then happen, and that was the case in China. The rise of now Sun Yat-sen, the nationalist. Those are the years of his life. He was born in a village south of Canton, and he's educated in Hawaii. He's a doctor, and he returns to practice medicine. He turns his full attention to the ills of Chinese society. And he managed to unite radical groups from across China into the so-called Revolutionary Alliance, or the Tongmenghui. And its program is based on the three people's principles of nationalism, mainly getting rid of the Manchus, who are foreigners. And there is an excellent box in the textbook, ladies and gentlemen, where his full statutes are written out. They're really worth a look. Nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. The three principles. And many other people, revolutionary movements from this time forward, they will resort to reading these principles as some of the guiding principles of their revolutions. And it called for a three-stage process, beginning with a military takeover and ending with constitutional democracy. In between here is a provisional constitution, ladies and gentlemen. That's the second step. And again, this in the 7th edition, the full program is laid out. Although the organization was small and relatively inexperienced, it's benefiting from the unrest that is going on. And it all culminates in the revolution of 1911. They're not going to be able to consolidate control for another 10 years, ladies and gentlemen. Sun's party doesn't have the military strength or the political base, so he's forced to turn to General Yuan Shikai, and the general then is going to be placed in charge because he has the military power to suppress any further rebellions. And eventually he acts on his own. And in negotiations with Sun Yat-sen's party, he becomes the new president. And that is the end of the Qing or Manchu Dynasty.